All right. Hello, everyone. Hello. Good evening. How is everyone doing? Hope you're having a wonderful day. So, let me just check if everything is set up correctly and if everything is working. And then we can start with today's class, which is about backward pawns and double pawns. And I hope everyone is very excited. Okay, seems like everything is working. All right, awesome. Okay, welcome. So, today, as you can see, we will be talking about double pawn and backward pawns. So, we're going to start off with the backward pawn. I have 3 games for you. I hope I can... we can look at them we can look at all 3 games in 1 hour. I'm not sure if I'll manage to do that, but we'll see how it goes. And I hope I'm good prepared. So we're gonna start off with the backward pawn. And before getting into it, let me ask you first, what is a backward pawn? Does anyone have an idea of what a backward pawn is? And let me know in the chat what you think. What do you think a backward pawn is? And you can already get a hint by looking at the board. So the pawn that's highlighted. What can a backward pawn possibly be? And then I'll give you a definition. Might call it like that. So. Does anyone have an idea what backward pawns are? Can anyone tell me what they do? One on its own, no helper pawns next to it. Yeah. It's not exactly by itself. It's not isolated. If there were no pawns next to that pawn, then that would be called an isolated pawn and not a backward pawn. So. Yeah, a backward pawn is basically a pawn that is behind the adjacent pawns, pawn/pawns. So in this example, the b7 pawn is a backward pawn because the adjacent pawn, which is a c6 pawn, it's behind that c6 pawn, and it cannot be protected. If there were a pawn, let's say, on a7, then that would not be a backward pawn anymore because it is not left behind. It can still be pushed forward and it can be defended. So backward pawns are usually a positional disadvantage because they are considered weak because they cannot be protected by their own pawns. And you need to defend them with your pieces, such as your rook, your queen, your knight, your bishop. And it's very hard to push your backward pawn because your opponent will most likely have a pawn. In this example, you have a pawn on c5, and it's very hard to push that pawn because white will take here. So a lonely pawn, it's not exactly lonely. It's not isolated because otherwise it would be called an isolated pawn, but there are always pawns next to it or one pawn, and it is just backward and left behind, and it cannot be pushed forward very easily. An example of an opening where we have backward pawns is actually the Najdorf, which I taught you about 2 weeks ago, I think. We saw this opening with, wait, let me show you how the Najdorf goes. For those who forgot about it or weren't here, I think. All right, is it here? No, here. C5. All right. So this is the Najdorf. So knight f6, knight c3, a6, and now after bishop e3, black will go e5. And now you can already see that black has a backward pawn. Black created a backward pawn himself. And now after moves like this, let's say f3, let's make some more moves. This is how Najdorf could go. So this is very typical. Let's say, white will of course try to attack the backward pawn. And also we'll try to put pieces in front of that pawn. Because usually the square in front of a backward pawn is very strong because there are no pawns to attack that piece because they're already pushed forward. And that's what white will try to do, especially in Najdorf, trying to put a knight on d5 and also control, black will try to push the d5 pawn when possible because it's not fun to be left behind with a backward pawn. But of course in Najdorf, black is aware that this is a backward pawn and also has some compensation. But we're not going to get into the Najdorf. I just wanted to show you how a backward pawn looks like. And let's get into the first game, which is played between Garry Kasparov, which you must all know, and Peter Svidler in 2004. So Garry Kasparov was white and Peter Svidler was black. So here we're going to see a very clear example of a backward pawn and how Garry managed to put pressure on it and eventually win that game. So let's see how it went. So d4, d5, c4, c6, and now we can see a Slav. This is a Slav with the c6 move. And now let's see what happens next. b5, and now Garry goes a4, trying to put pressure on the b5 pawn and break that chain. Black pushes that pawn because otherwise white will be able to take that pawn, removing a knight because it's attacked. Black is attacking the e4 pawn. White is pushing. I'm going a bit fast over the opening because I want to show you when the moment is when the backward pawn is actually clearly visible. So now white takes back the pawn. Let's make some more moves. a5, protecting the b4 pawn, of course. And white, Garry Kasparov went knight to c1, trying to reroute the knight onto a better square. Now black develops the knight too, and Garry went knight to b3. So knight to b3, we rerouted the knight to a better square, and also controlling the c5 square a bit because we do not really want black to push the backward pawn. Like we mentioned, black wants to push that pawn because it's a backward pawn, but white in this case does not want to allow that and wants to control the square in front of it and also put pressure on a c file and eventually take that c6 pawn. So okay, so Svidler went h6, we castle, the queen develops, we develop our queen too, and now we're actually making some space for a rook to go to c1 and double the rooks on the c file to put pressure on that pawn. Now black goes bishop a6, and now we can already see that Garry is starting to put pressure on it. Not immediately, not directly, because there's still a bishop that's blocking the c file. But once we get to straight the bishop, which will happen, white will have more control over the c file and will put more pressure on that c6 pawn. So rook c1, and now black castles, and Kasparov took the bishop, and now we can see that the rook is directly looking at the c6 pawn. So black will have to take it back. Our queen, well, we have to do something about it because it's not protected. So we trade off the queens. Svidler took back, and now we can fully concentrate on putting pressure on that c6 pawn and put some pieces on a c5 square or controlling the c5 square. So let's see what Kasparov did. Here, instead of doubling the rooks immediately, Kasparov went king to f1 because it's always a good idea to put your king closer to the center when you're, well, basically heading into an endgame. You usually want your king in the center and not at the edge of the board. You want your king to be close to your pieces. And now Svidler went rook to c8, already defending that pawn because, well, we do not want to lose that pawn. Now the king gets even closer. So yeah, like I said, in general, black, when you're left with a backward pawn, you want to exchange that pawn. Here in this case, you might think that c5 is possible because it's well defended, and if you count, it's attacked 3 times So the c5 square, I mean, it's protected 3 times, the rook and the pawn. And it is protected with the rook, the knight, and the bishop. So it should be possible to push the c5 pawn. But let's see what happens after black pushes it now, because it's not really black will not be very happy after white takes that pawn. So take, and the knight will take back. And instead of trading the knights off, we can simply go rook c4, because after knight takes b3, the rook on c8 is hanging. So it's a pin. So the knight cannot take the knight on b3. And after, let's say, rook to c6, trying to protect that knight more, we will win this a5 pawn. So it's a very annoying pin, I would say. And the rook is basically tied down to protecting that. So c5 would not really be a good move here. And that's what Peter Svidler saw as well. And that's why he went king to f8, getting the king closer as well. And black is basically trying to get the king to the d8 square to protect this rook, so that there are no annoying pins anymore on the c file. So let's see what happens next. Now Gary went rook to c2 with the idea to double up the rooks on the c file, and now king e8. And now, instead of getting the rook on c1 now to double up the rooks, Gary went bishop e3. And bishop e3 is actually a very good move, because you're basically preventing the idea of c6 to c5. You don't want black to push c5. Even though in the previous example we saw that it was not that, in previous variation we saw that it was not that good, because there would be like a pin there. But black is actually getting his king closer to the rook now. So once that king is on d8, like I said, there won't be a pin anymore, because the king is protecting that rook. And yeah, the knight can just, if the knight is on c5, the knight will just simply get away, and the rook will not fall. So that's why Gary went bishop e3, just to simply prevent black to push c5. Because once that pawn is pushed and gets exchanged, then it's not really a weakness anymore, and the c file is opened up. And it's not that bad for black anymore. Okay, so now Svidler went knight to b6. I'm not sure how to explain that move, because 2 moves later he goes back to d5. So I guess he's just trying to figure out what he wants to do. So knight b6, or it's just a waiting move. That's also possible. All right. Gary has a clear plan, of course. The clear plan is, of course, to put pressure on a c6 pawn and also control the c5 square. So Gary went knight to e1 with the idea to reroute the knight to d3 and control the c5 square even more. So that is nice. So like I said, if you have a backward pawn, so in this case black has a backward pawn, usually the square in front of it can be very interesting for your opponent to put pieces on, because it cannot be attacked by any pawns, because the pawns are pushed forward. So knight to e1. Okay. Also the pawn cannot push itself forward. Then that's also a good idea when you put your piece in front of a pawn. So the pawn push will just simply not be possible. Okay. Now h5. Is it clear so far? Am I going too fast, by the way? You should always let me know if I'm going too fast, because yeah, I've had it 2 weeks ago with the knight Earth, and I don't want to have any criticism again. So at least knight b6 attacks a4, true, but it is protected by the rook on a1 though. Okay, so knight b6, you're basically tying the rook on a1 down to a4 so that there's no rook c1, otherwise the pawn on a4 is hanging. That is true, yeah. Yeah, true. Okay, h5 now. And now, like I said, Kasparov wants to put the knight on d3 to put more pressure on the c5 square And now black is simply not able to push that pawn because there are just too many pieces attacking that square, and black has not that many pieces protecting that square. Okay. And both sides are just improving their position, especially white. White is, of course, slightly better because black is just stuck with the backward pawn. Okay, so knight goes back to d5, and we go g3. And f6, black is now trying to open up the position, trying to trade off some things, but also he creates some weaknesses. And as you can see, the pawn on h5 is actually kind of weak and kind of loose, and that could be a target at some point. So after f6, Gary now went rook to c1. Luckily, there's no knight on b6, otherwise this pawn on a4 would be hanging. So rook to c1, putting pressure on c6, and the king went to f7. We take that pawn, and black takes it back. So there's no use of actually putting your king to on d6. There's not going to be c5 anyway because there are just too many pieces attacking that square. So black decides to go to the king side and try to create some advantage there maybe. So now knight to f4, and black took with a check. We take back. Still, the pawn is attacked. These two rooks are basically tied down to that pawn. They can't move anywhere. They can't be active. The rook cannot go to g8 or anything, or try to control some files. It's just simply not possible because they need to be there to protect the c6 pawn. So bishop f4, white took it back. Of course, if white took back with the g pawn, then that would lead to some more pawn islands, which does not look nice. If white took back with the pawn, it would also lead to double pawns, which we will get into later. So yeah, Gary took with the bishop, of course, best move here. Also controlling a nice diagonal here on a b8, h2 diagonal. So bishop takes, knight to f8, and knight to c5. So now finally Kasparov is getting a piece in front of the backward pawn, which is a c5 square. And it cannot be driven away by any other pawns because, well, it's a backward pawn. So, okay. Let's see. Okay, so knight to c5, and Huttl decided to take that knight because it's kind of annoying to have a knight on c5 there. Very strong. And now we take it back with our rook, of course. If we took back with our pawn, however, then the pawn on c6 will not be a target anymore. Then it's not that weak anymore, and it's not a backward pawn anymore. So of course we take back with the rook, trying to put as much pressure as we can. The rooks still are tied down to the pawn, cannot go anywhere, need to protect the pawn. And also the pawn on h5 is under attack. See? It's now a target. h5 is very weak now. There are no pawns on a g-file. We can call it an isolated pawn. It's unprotected. And yeah, okay. So now Peter decides to go f5 in order to keep that h5 pawn. And all right, but actually it's kind of weakening the black squares, as you can see, because now Kasparov went bishop to g5, controlling some more black squares. It's kind of weakening, but at the same time it was protecting the h5 pawn, so it's a little bit double. All right, so white is taking away some squares of the king as well as controlling the black squares. Okay. Now, Huttl went knight to d7, attacking the rook on c5, because, well, the knight on f8 was not doing much anyway. Needs to get to a better square, and also attacking the rook. So we retreat, of course, and the king goes to g6, attacking the bishop. And instead of retreating our bishop back to f4, Kasparov went h4, protects the bishop immediately, and yeah, okay. So is everything clear until now? I hope it is. So basically you should just, basically it's very clear that white is just putting pressure on a c6 pawn, and everything leads to that pawn. Okay, h4. King goes back to f7, does not have much to do on g6 anymore because the bishop is now protected. And now white went f3. And now black decided to sacrifice that pawn because, well, Svidler could not stand the pressure anymore, I think. And the rooks are just tied down. They can't do anything. They just need to be there and protect the pawn. And yeah, so he finally decided to give up on that pawn in order to get some more freedom. But of course, white takes it now and has a passed pawn, as you can see. Black cannot take it back because it's protected twice. And yep, so we basically are a pawn up, and we have a passed pawn. So that's very nice. And now Svidler went rook to c6, trying to take that pawn. And instead of going bishop e3, protecting that pawn again, which would actually not be that good because black has got some compensation with the move e5. And instead of going bishop to e3, Kasparov went rook to d1, counter-attacking the knight on d7. And what Kasparov is actually hoping is that Svidler would take on c5 with the knight. So let's see what happens after Peter takes that pawn. Let's see what a variation is. Okay, so knight takes c5. All right, it looks very tempting, right? So you're winning back a pawn and everything is cool, but after rook back to c1, you're basically pinning that knight again. And there's this continuous pin on the c file, which is very annoying for black because the black knights can't really move anywhere because the rook on c6 will be captured. So let's say knight a6, we will just simply take that rook, and after black takes, we are just a rook up. So that is just simply not possible, and it can be very annoying. So yeah, it's very hard to get out of that pin. So that's why Svidler did not take that pawn, as it will lead to a very annoying pin. Instead, he went knight to b6. And here you might think, all right, yeah, true, white cannot take the knight because otherwise black will take the rook on c2 and we are in exchange down. But I actually analyzed it with the computer, and the computer says that it's actually possible for white to take that knight because let's see what happens after we take that knight. Of course, black will take the rook. We're in exchange down. But keep in mind, there's a pawn on b6, and it's a very strong pawn, actually. It's actually a passed pawn, and it's 2 moves from promoting on a b8 square. So even though white is down in exchange, white has got a lot of compensation. So after, well, there's a check. After king to e3, let's say, getting out of the check, and white and black tries to attack that pawn, we can get our rook into the 7th rank, given a check. And after king to e8, we have rook e7. And let's say after king f8, we can take that pawn. And white is actually doing great. Has a very strong pawn on the b6 square. And the black pawns are separated and can be very weak. So it's actually not a bad idea to take that knight. So Kasparov could totally do that. Could have done that, actually. But he didn't. And he went bishop to e3. So, yeah, Kasparov could have taken a knight, actually, but instead he went bishop back to e3. Okay, interesting position. So now Svidler saw a free pawn on a4, and of course he took it. The rook on a1 is gone, is on a d file now, and which means that the pawn on a4 is no longer protected. So Svidler can now just simply take that pawn. Very delicious, yummy. So, all right. But it looks kind of scary though with a knight on the rim on a4, because it looks like it can be trapped any moment. Knight cannot escape, cannot go back to b6, cannot go to c5, There are not much squares to go to. But after rook a1, it is not trapped, as black has a very strong move in his game. And I'm not gonna. You know what? Let me ask you. What move does black have here? So the black knight cannot go anywhere, as you can see. It's a bit stuck on a4, but Svidler had a very nice move here, and yeah, it kind of helped the knight escape. So what move did black play here? What do you think? What move could save that knight? What move did black play? You're saying knight back to b6. Okay, but if you go back to b6, then then the a5 pawn is hanging, no? And now white is actually is having a very strong position. So no, it's not a knight move. It's not a knight move. And I'm seeing the correct answer in chat. Very good. Let me see if the Twitch chat has said anything. Dutch J, hello. Yes, b3. b3 is indeed the move. What's the move that Svidler played? All right, so b3, attacking, counter-attacking the rook on c2, and getting a knight back into the game. So, all right, so now Kasparov went rook to d2, and Svidler is able to take back that pawn. Very nice, this move. All right, so now Kasparov takes the pawn on a5, and, all right. And yeah, well, Svidler has been defending very well so far, but still he has a very unpleasant situation, unpleasant position. The 7th rank can be occupied by white. White has control over two very strong files. Even though the material is equal, the bishop is better than the knight, and the black knight is also slightly weakened. The game actually went on for another 20 moves. I'm actually gonna stop the game here, because the rest of the game is not really that interesting, because, well, black now already got rid of the backward pawn, but eventually Kasparov won the game with some struggles, but he won. So yeah, this was a game with a backward pawn played between Kasparov and Svidler. So yeah, Kasparov handled it very well, in my opinion. And yeah, he won this game eventually. All right, so let me look at the time. I only have half an hour. I still need to show you 2 games. I hope I will be able to show you the other 2 games, but we'll see. Okay, now let's get into double pawns. So we've been talking about backrank pawns for a while now. Now let's have a look at double pawns. So what are double pawns? It's actually very self-explanatory. Those are pawns that are doubled. Wow. Surprise. So yeah, double pawns are actually 2 pawns residing on the same file. So in this case, we have a pawn on c4 and on c3, and they're doubled, so they're on the same file. And when do double pawns occur? Well, usually it happens when you capture a pawn or a piece on the adjacent file where there's another pawn. So in this case, there was probably a pawn on c4, and white took with either the b pawn or the d pawn towards the c4, to the c file, and took on c4. So that's why white now has a double pawn, because white definitely captured something. Otherwise, you wouldn't have double pawns. So it's because of a capture. And in most cases, double pawns are considered as a weakness due to their inability to defend each other. But there's a but, they're not always weak. There are cases where double pawns are actually not that bad and where they're actually pretty good and helpful. And I'm going to show you a game or 2. I think, yeah, 2 games one and a half actually, games where it's actually good to have double pawns and where they're not that bad actually, and also a game where double pawns are a weakness. So it could go two ways, but most people don't like having double pawns because yeah, it's mostly weak, and you don't really like especially in endgames. You don't. Let me show you an example of an opening where you have double pawns in the opening already. So, and we're not that bad actually. So let me see, e4, I think it was e4, e5, knight f3, in the Berlin here. So here we usually get a double pawn here for black. It's not that bad for black because black has a bishop pair. So this is an example of double pawns in the opening where it's not that bad. And also here, after knight takes, the pawn takes, there's also double pawn, which is not that bad. But of course, if you get into an endgame, it can be decisive because white here is up a pawn on the queen side and will easily make a pass pawn. As for black, it's much harder to create a pass pawn on the king side because the pawns are doubled. So in an endgame, it would be better for white, but here, of course, it's not an endgame, and yeah. Let me see. Wait, let me first show you the game. Okay, a gameplay between Smyslov and Robach. All right. It's not a double pawn, it's an extra open file. There are some advantages of having double pawns though. Yeah, I forgot to say that. There are advantages of having double pawns because mostly when you have double pawns, the adjacent files are open or half open, and it can be very useful to put your rooks on those files. So that's an advantage of having double pawns though, because there will be open files next to it. And you also control more squares if you have double pawns. So yeah, there are advantages, but of course there are also disadvantages because the double pawns can be a target very easily, especially the pawn in front can be targeted very easily, which we will see in this game actually. I think it's this game. Wait, let me see. Let me check if I have the correct game in front of me. I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. All right. Okay. So let's start with the next game. Yeah, very good, Calvin. True. Yes, but some double pawns can also be protected by your own pawns sometimes. Especially when you think about the Italian game, you usually, when you put your bishop on e3 and black, for those who know the Italian, I'm saying this, when black takes that bishop on e3 and we take it back, we have double pawns, right, on the e file. And then you will be able to push your d4 pawn. So this is for those who know what the Italian is, but for those who don't know, well, maybe I'll explain it some other time. But for now, I'll get into the next game. So this is gameplay between Smyslov and Robach in 1974. And we start off with an English. So let's get into some more moves. Bishop e3. Now knight to c6. And now on the 8th move already, white took the knight on c6, which leads to double pawns for black already on the 8th move. So these are, you will see that this is an example of weak double pawns, as white will be able to target those pawns very easily. So now the queen to c1 is already looking indirectly at the c6 pawn. And Smyslov is white and Robach is black. So h5, knight to f3, developing some pieces. Because of course you don't want to, you want to castle first, and then also get some more pieces on the c file and attack that pawn And never forget to castle. But yeah, knight to g5. Of course, here after bishop to g4, black has the idea to take on f3. That's what black wants to do, because once black takes that knight, white will also be stuck with double pawns, and will also have a weak pawn on d3 after bishop takes and e takes f3. And that's why Smyslov went knight to g5, because it did not want to be captured. And now knight to d5. And Smyslov took the knight. All right, now question time. So Robach took with the queen. Why did he not take with the pawn and just simply get rid of the doubled pawn? Because that makes sense, right? If you have doubled pawns and you have the opportunity to get rid of those pawns, then why don't you take that opportunity? Why did Smyslov not take the knight with the pawn? Because it looks like a logical move, and just simply getting rid of that pawn. What can white do here? And it's not very pleasant for black. Okay, I see queen to c6, check. Sacrificing the queen. Oh no, this is not about sacrificing. You wanna, oh, okay. Check the black king. Yes, indeed. It's indeed, yeah, you have queen c6. It's not a tactic or anything, but it can be kind of unpleasant for black, I would say, because what is the only good move for black here? So what happens after queen d7? Let's see. Why can't black go queen d7? Or bishop d7? And why is black forced to go king f8? Yeah, indeed. After queen d7, of course, there is queen takes a8. So that the queen move is not possible. And also after bishop d7, you can see that this pawn is hanging. So white will be able to take that pawn. So the only reasonable move here for black is king f8. But of course, it looks very ugly to have a king on f8. And black will not be able to castle anymore. And definitely now, white also has control over the c file. White is putting pressure on the c7 pawn. And it's definitely looking better for white. So that's why Robach was a little bit scared to take back with the pawn, because it looks very, very ugly, and rather be stuck with the doubled pawns and take with the queen. Okay, so now Smyslov went f3, attacking the bishop, and Robach went rook b8, targeting the b2 pawn rather than moving the bishop away, because you're threatening to take that with your bishop. And now Smyslov protected the pawn with rook b1, and now black is basically forced to move back the bishop. Okay, and now we go b3, trying to get away from that threat, and f6. F6 looks like a weird move actually to me. I don't think that's a good move, because you're blocking that bishop, you're blocking diagonal, and two, you're kind of weakening your king, kind of. So a better move would have been queen to a5 check, and then you're attacking the king and also the pawn at the same time. I think that would have been a better move for black. Yeah, f6 is just blocking the bishop's diagonal, and it's actually pushing the knight to a better square. Knight to e4. Also, also a strong square to put your pieces at is in front of the doubled pawns, because also, just as the backward pawn, it cannot be driven away by other pawns, because there are no other pawns here in this position. All right, knight to e4 and g5. So that's probably what Robac wanted to do, to push those pawns on the king's side, but it's not really considered as a strong attack because the king has not castled yet. And Smyslov is not going to castle. So king f2, he went. King f2. Also getting the rook into the game later on, and a5. All right, because the pawn was also attacked by the bishop here. a5, also maybe with the idea to push a4 at some point. And now knight to c5. So the knight got to a better square. From e4, he went to c5. Nice square, dominating the c5 square with the knight. It cannot be driven away by any other pawns of the black side. And now bishop to c8. Black probably does not want to lose his only advantage here with the double bishops. The bishop pair, everything is double here. No, the bishop pair, I meant to say, keeping the bishop pair, because that's probably the only advantage Black has. Okay, so bishop to c8 and now h4, also trying to prevent a possible kingside attack. I don't think it's a very strong attack that Robac has, but now we try to trade off the queens. Once we trade off the queens, the double pawns can still be very, very weak, and we can still get our rooks on the c file. So e5, and now we go rook hc1, getting our rooks on a c file, and f5. Black is really going for a counter attack, but it's not really working. And all right. Okay, so knight to a. I was just checking if everything's all right. Never mind. All right, knight to a4. Now we moved our knight, and now we're looking at the pawn on c6, and we're putting pressure. And actually, it's a threat now. Actually, white is now threatening to take that pawn because it's protected once and attacked twice with the queen and the rook. So this is a threat now, and instead of defending that pawn, Black took on f3. Of course, we take back first, and f4. So Black just does not want to protect that pawn. It's really going for a counterattack, but White really managed to take good care of it. And now the pawn march is not that scary anymore. So even though the bishop is attacked now, we can simply take that pawn with our queen. All right, and the c6 pawn is still a weakness. So here the double pawns are really, really weak, as you can see, and are actually a target. And white is just much better here. White's position is just looking much better. The king on e8 is just looking very, very vulnerable. And now after rook f8, trying to drive away that queen and also putting pressure on the f3 pawn. If the queen goes to a bad square, then Black will be able to take that pawn. But of course, we don't have to move our queen to a bad square. We go queen e4, basically forcing a trade. So queen e4 check, and Black takes. Of course, we only have one move to take back the queen, and that's d takes e4. And now Black goes bishop g4. That's actually a good move if White didn't have f4. So bishop g4 is now attacking the f3 pawn. But of course, if White did not have that f4 move, then it would have been a strong move for Black, because the pawn on f4 is very weak. But f4 is possible here, and those are just two passed pawns, which you can see on e4 and f4. They're very strong. They're protected by the bishop. The f4 pawn is protected by the bishop, and the other pawn can also be defended very easily. And now bishop to f6, attacking the h4 pawn. and Smyslov went rook to h1. If Smyslov went king to g3, which looks like a very logical move, then Roboch could have played rook to g8, and also, yeah, it's also looking at the king and looks a little bit unpleasant. So that's why he went rook to h1. So there's no such thing. Rook to h1, protecting that pawn. We don't like to lose unnecessary pawns. And now rook to d8. However, for black, rook to b4 would have been better. Actually, attacking some pawns, a pawn on e4, and actually, putting some pressure on d8. It's not really threatening anything. It's also not threatening to go to d2 because the bishop is protecting that square. So now white is just totally winning. It's much better here. Mostly because of, these pawns are just so weak. These pawns are passed pawns. And after rook c1, attacking the c6 pawn, still a weakness. Black goes back because you can't really protect that pawn anymore. After a move like, let's say, rook d6, these pawns on e5, on e4 and f4, as you can see, are just very powerful, and now you can just push the f5 pawn. If you go e5 here, then black will be able to take that pawn, I think, and then that is not good. So instead of e5, you can go f5, and it's pretty hopeless for black. It's pretty hopeless. So now bishop back to c8, trying to get a bishop on the a6 diagonal maybe. But now f5 again, rook to g8. We take that pawn. The bishop moves. It's gonna be over soon. We take another pawn. White is just totally winning, totally dominating with those two pawns, those two passed pawns. Took the doubled pawns. And rook on the 7th rank. Everything is just better. Everything is just working out better for white. And now with a check, it's not even doing anything. It's not even winning a pawn. Rook to d3, and now we go rook c1, and this bishop is attacked. There will be another rook on the 7th rank. The pawns will push, and it's just game over. Yep. Okay. That was a very hectic game, right? Yes. All right. It was a really good example of showing how weak doubled pawns can be. In this game, you really saw how white took care of that. But, of course, double pawns are not always a weakness. They can also be a fortress, which we'll see later on. Not really a fortress, but they can work out for you pretty good sometimes. Okay, let's look at another game where these pawns are actually pretty good. I'm actually going to skip the opening because I see that I only have 12 minutes left and I still want to show you the other game. So I'm going to jump to move 20. Okay, I think it was somewhere here. All right, here. All right, I'm going to show you from here what happened. So here we have another double pawn. Again, they're not protected by any other pawns. There are no adjacent pawns that are protecting them. But they're not weak. They're not weak at all. Why? Well, as you can see, white has a bishop pair. These pawns, these bishops are looking at the king. They can be very strong. And these pawns will just simply push. And once these pawns push, it will be very, very scary for black. And black is just not doing great here. Who are the players? The player with the white pieces was Mikhail Botvinnik. And with the black pieces, Max Oebe. Was played in 1948. So those were the players. And Botvinnik was white and Oebe was black. So Botvinnik won this game with the white pieces. So let's see how he did it. So we have double pawns here on the e-file. They look weak, but they're not. Let's see what happens. Botvinnik wins, exactly. So b6. Yeah, well, maybe getting that bishop on a better square. Rook to d1. So after the bishop moves to, let's say, a6 or b7, we get rook to d7. We can get our rook to the 7th rank. So the bishop is a little bit stuck on c8 to protect that square. All right. Now, knight to g6. And white goes rook to d6, attacking that. So b7 the b7 pawn pushed to b6 was kind of weakening the c6 pawn. Now the rook is on d6, attacking that pawn. White is doing pretty great. Yeah, the bishops are very strong here. They're very strong, and once you can push your e4 pawn, that it's just gonna be unstoppable. So bishop to a6, attacking that rook, but that's no problem. The rook can just simply move to f2, protecting that pawn with bishop b5, and now, like I said, white is pushing the pawn to e5 with the idea to go e6 and get even a stronger position, getting the diagonal open up for the bishop. So that's just going to be very, very strong. And once you push that pawn, it's not going to be a weakness anymore. Once you get to trade off that pawn, you will be left with just this pawn, a single pawn, an isolated pawn, but they're not double pawns anymore. So knight to e7. All right. And now we simply push that other pawn. So you're taking away the squares of black. You're taking away the d5 square, the f5 square, the d6 square, the f6 square. So the little pawns can be very strong sometimes. They can look over other, they can look over squares of each other. So here's a, how do you call it? A square, you might call it, or a rectangle, I don't know. So e4 and now c5. So black cannot put his knight on d5 or f5 or whatsoever, and pushes c5 maybe to get the knight to c6. And now e6, we push that pawn, trying to trade off that pawn and get a nice open diagonal for the bishop. Instead of taking it, black goes f6, but now we have a pass pawn because the pawn did not take that pawn. We have a pass pawn now, which can also be strong once the knight gets out of the way. And now we just simply take a pawn there because it was not protected. And we have a pass pawn, so everything is working out for white. Now bishop c6, attacking the e4 pawn and also blocking the rook of the 6th rank. We can just simply take it because maybe I should have asked you what move to play here, but maybe it would have been too hard to see it because after take, we get the move e7. Yeah, because now after e7, there's a check, and after the king moves, we can just simply take that rook, which was a nice little tactic actually by Botvinnik. I should have asked you what move to play here, but I went too fast. So yeah, that was actually a very nice tactic here. But it was lost anyway, because this pawn is just way too strong. These pawns are weak. Everything is weak. The bishops are too strong. So you were just going to ask if that pawn, if taking that pawn was bad. Yeah, it was possible because it was not protected. So yeah, the forward pawn is just very, very strong. And the fact that black did not take it makes it even stronger. So yeah, all right, that was very nicely played by Botvinnik, like really pushing those pawns forward. But really thanks to this bishop pair. If this bishop pair wasn't there, then, well, especially the a2 bishop was very strong because it was, well, basically protecting the e6 square. And yeah, it's possible to take that pawn. All right, okay, all right. Now, that is another example of strong pawns. No, actually, no. Now I'm going to show you another example of strong pawns. So this was the first example. Now I'm going to show you the second example. And let me, yep, all right. So this is the second example of strong doubled pawns. You would definitely have messed up that position without your queen. There was no queen on the board anyway. Or which position do you mean? So here's a second example of strong double pawns. And this game was again played by Mikhail Botvinnik with the white pieces again. And the black pieces were Nikolai Tikhonovic Sorokin. Yeah. All right. So here you can see that the double pawns are protected by another pawn. So there's an adjacent pawn that's protecting the e4 pawn. So they're not that weak. They're basically a fortress, you might call. Hey, Scott Stanley, hello. I'm teaching the backward pawn and the double pawns. So now we're looking at double pawns. And that they're not always weak. So here we have a perfect example of double pawns that aren't weak and are protected by another pawn next to it. So yeah, mostly, well, when you have double pawns in the center, especially in Italian, like I already said, when you have the Italian, you usually get to trade, you mostly get to trade off those bishops on e3, and then you have those double pawns on the e file, and then you get to push d4. So that's an example of double pawns that are kind of strong and protecting your pawns. And here we basically have the same, but with a pawn on f3. So we're protecting the e4 pawn, and black doesn't really have the opportunity to attack one of these pawns. They're very well protected. And I already highlighted in the beginning, these squares are controlled by whites, and there's no way that black can put his knights on any of those squares, because the pawns are just controlling all of these squares. Yeah, the pawns control important. Yeah, indeed, there are very important squares that the white pawns are controlling, so that the knights cannot possess any of these squares. All right, so here, let me ask you what move did white play here? It was actually a very strong move. Yeah, instead of telling you myself, let me ask you, what move did white play here? What move would you play? It's a logical move, actually. It's not a tricky one. It's a pretty logic one. All right, let's see. Black doesn't control blockade square, d5. All right, very good, Dutch Day. Yep, that's a very good move. Indeed, that's actually the move that was played. Someone says f4. There's a better move than f4. When you push f4, then you're not protecting the e4 pawn anymore. But I can kind of see why you want to push f4. But there's actually a very strong move here, and yeah, some people have already said it. It's indeed knight to d5. And knight to d5 is actually very good because, well, black doesn't really want to take that knight, because if black takes that knight, then we can take back with our pawn and we have a passed pawn. So instead of taking a knight, Sorokin, I don't know how it's pronounced, Sorokin, went a knight to c6, and also putting some pressure on the a5 pawn and trying not to trade it off. But now, of course, Botvinnik has a nice move, and what did he play here? What did Botvinnik play? And no, we are not protecting the a5 pawn. We do not care about the a5 pawn, not now. What move did Botvinnik play here? Doing the same that white has too. Little hint. Knight of 6 or rook takes c6. Ooh. Yeah, your first suggestion was correct. Indeed. Knight to f6. Knight takes f6. Indeed. Knight takes f6, and now you are also creating a double pawn for black. Indeed. So now black has double pawns. And now white can get to the 7th rank because there was a knight on f6 protecting that d7 square, and after we take a knight, creating a double pawn for black, we get to put our rook on a 7th rank. And black, as you can see, it's a combination of double pawns and a backward pawn. Can you see it? How nice is that? I didn't even notice that we had a combination of those two. So black is also a backward pawn here. So now we're attacking that backward pawn. Very logical, yes. A very logical move to put your rook on a 7th rank and attacking a pawn. And, well, black is kind of forced to protect that pawn because b6 is not really possible. b5 isn't possible either because we will just simply take a takes b6. So the pawn is backward and needs to be defended by other pieces. That's what a backward pawn is about. Okay, so now Botvinnik got the king closer to the center. Also, maybe with the idea to go rook g1 with a check. Not that it's mating, but still. Now Sarkin took the free pawn on a5, but of course it's still completely lost for black, as white can just simply get the other rook on the 7th rank. All right, so now we have 2 rooks on the 7th rank, and also putting pressure on the f7 pawn. It's just everything is falling for black. And now after rook c8, of course, black wants to tries to trade off some pieces, tries to get rid of the pressure, but of course we can just simply take that pawn. Can we double the rooks on the 7th? You might call it like that, doubling our rooks on the 7th. All right, take, and we take back with a check now. And after king h8, we get our bishop on d5. As you can see, white is just much, much better. The bishop is much stronger than the knight. The knight is on the rim. It's not doing much. The b7 pawn is weak. After b5, we have b3. And now you're taking away the squares of the black knights. So the knight on a5 is just not doing anything anymore. And you're taking away all of the squares, so the knight cannot go to c4, not to c6, not to b7, cannot take on b3, and the knight is just, out of the game, basically. And here, actually, Sarkin, with the black pieces, resigned, and Botvinnik won. So that's what happened. If it's a Grandmaster game, looking at a brilliant exchange sack can't hurt. True, though. True. Yeah, that is true. All right. Yeah, black can't really do anything now. And it's just hopeless. Great game, right? Yeah. I think that's all I had to show you guys. I had, 3 games I showed you. And some fragments of games, and yeah, I hope you have a better idea now of what backward pawns are and what double pawns are, and I hope I taught you something, and yeah, all right, and I think that's it for today's class, and I really hope everything was clear. If not, then you can personally come by and punch me in the face. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, have a good day or night, everyone, and I'll see you back. I'm not sure if I'll be back next week because I have to study for exams, but we'll see about that. So see you later, guys. Bye-bye.